The dust tasted of failure. Mercy felt it coat her tongue, grit between her teeth, a fine red powder settling in the lines around her eyes. It was the same dust that had claimed her husband, rising from his lungs in a final, rattling cough. It was the dust that had swallowed the last of their water 2 days ago, and the dust that had finally broken the spirit of their old mare that morning. Now it was just her son Leo, and a single, worn leather saddlebag containing everything they had left in the world. The ranch spread out before her like a kingdom, a sprawl of barns and corrals and a main house big enough to swallow the church back in Ohio. It was the kind of place that had no room for a woman with nothing but a child on her hip and a story she was too tired to tell. Leo's small hand was fisted in her skirt, his thumb in his mouth. He was 4 years old and had walked the last 5 miles without a single complaint, a silence that scared her more than any cry would have. His resilience was a mirror of her own, a thing forged in loss and necessity. She shifted the weight of the saddlebag on her shoulder. It held a spare dress for her, a shirt for Leo, her husband's Bible, and a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Not enough to start a life, but maybe enough to beg for one. A man on the porch of the main house watched them approach. He was as solid and unmoving as the mountains that formed the horizon behind him. He didn't rise from his chair, just watched their slow, stumbling progress across the hard-packed yard. 2 other men, ranch hands by their look, stopped their work mending a fence to stare. Mercy felt their eyes on her like a physical weight, measuring her poverty, her desperation. She lifted her chin. She had not come this far to be broken by a stare. When she finally stood before the porch, the man's silence was a wall. He was broad-shouldered, his face carved from hard lines and shadow, a darkness in his eyes that had nothing to do with the sun. He looked at Leo, and for a fleeting second, something shifted in that stony expression. A flicker of something that looked like pain. Then it was gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable distance. Looking for something? His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Work, Mercy said. The word came out a croak. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing strength into it. I can cook, clean, mend. I can keep a ledger. I can read and write. I'll do any work you have. He said nothing. His gaze dropped back to Leo, who had hidden his face in the folds of Mercy's skirt. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken refusal. One of the ranch hands snickered, a cruel scraping sound. Ain't no charity house, ma'am, the hand said, a man with a mean squint and tobacco-stained teeth. The boss man, Mr. Gideon, he don't take in strays. Mercy ignored the hand and kept her eyes on the man in the chair. Gideon. The name suited him. It sounded like something ancient and unyielding. I am not asking for charity, Mr. Gideon. I am asking for a chance to earn my keep. And my son's. Gideon's jaw tightened. He looked away from her, out toward the endless stretch of his land, a land of grass and sky that promised everything and gave nothing for free. She could see the war in him, the impulse to say no clashing with something deeper, something he fought to keep buried. She did not know what it was, but she saw its shadow in his eyes. He was a man carrying a heavy load of his own. He finally pushed himself to his feet. He was taller than she'd thought, a man who blocked out the sun. Jeb, he said, his voice sharp, directed at the sneering ranch hand. Show her the old line cabin by the creek. See that she has a bucket and some soap. She can work in the laundry. He looked at Mercy, his eyes holding no warmth, only a kind of weary resignation. You'll work for your meals and a roof, nothing more. The moment your work falters or you cause trouble, you are gone. Is that understood? Yes, she said, the relief so sharp it almost buckled her knees. Thank you. He did not acknowledge her thanks. He simply turned and walked back into the deep shadows of the house, leaving her standing in the brutal sun with the foreman, Jeb, whose hostile gaze promised that her troubles were far from over. He had given her a chance, not out of kindness, but out of some grudging obligation she couldn't fathom. It was enough. For now, it had to be. The line cabin was little more than a shed, one room with a packed dirt floor, a stone hearth, and a cot frame with no mattress. The air was thick with the smell of disuse and mice, but it had 4 walls and a roof that looked mostly solid. It was a palace. Jeb dropped a bucket, a bar of lye soap, and a stack of threadbare blankets on the floor. "Wash house is behind the bunkhouse," he grumbled. "Cook rings the bell for meals. Your boy stays out of the way. Don't want him spooking the horses or getting underfoot." He looked around the cabin with a sneer. "Don't get comfortable." Mercy said nothing. She waited until his footsteps receded, then sank onto the floor, pulling Leo into her lap. She held him tight, breathing in the dusty smell of his hair. He was asleep, his small body gone limp with exhaustion. She looked at the rough walls of her new home. It wasn't a place of welcome, but it was a place of safety. A place to stop running. She had carried her child and her saddlebag to the edge of the world, and a man with haunted eyes had, for reasons of his own, decided not to push her off. The days fell into a rhythm of lye soap and boiling water. Mercy's hands, already calloused, became raw and chapped from the endless cycle of scrubbing the ranch hand's filthy clothes. She worked from before sunup to after sundown, her back aching and her arms feeling heavy as lead. She saw Gideon only from a distance, a solid figure on horseback directing his men, his presence a constant, silent pressure on the horizon. He never spoke to her, never acknowledged her beyond a curt nod if their paths crossed. It was as if their brief conversation on the porch had never happened. He had given her a place, and now he expected her to become invisible within it. She learned the hierarchy of the ranch through observation. Jeb, the foreman, was a petty tyrant who enjoyed his small measure of power. The other hands were a mix of sullen, hard-working men who ignored her, and a few younger ones who watched her with a speculative curiosity she found unnerving. She kept her head down, her answers short, her focus entirely on her work and on Leo. Leo was her son. In the evenings, when her work was done, they would sit by the creek behind their cabin. She taught him the names of the wildflowers that grew there and told him stories her mother had told her. In this small, private world, she could forget the ache in her back and the gnawing uncertainty of their future. She could just be a mother, and he could just be a boy. It was in her 3rd week that she first noticed the waste. She was mending a stack of flour sacks when she saw the cook toss a half slab of bacon to the dogs because it was a day past his preferred use. The next day, she saw Jeb order a barrel of nails from the traveling supply wagon, even though she had seen 3 identical, half-full barrels behind the smithy's shop. There was no order, no system. The ranch ran on habit and assumption, a massive, powerful machine that was leaking resources from a dozen different places. Her husband had been a clerk, a man of meticulous ledgers and careful sums. He had taught her the beauty of numbers, the clean logic of a balanced account. The chaos of the ranch's operations offended something deep within her, but it was not her place to speak. Her place was the wash house. Her currency was silence and hard work. That changed the day the supply wagon broke an axle 5 miles out. It carried the monthly provisions, including the grain for the horses and the salt for curing the meat from the last slaughter. Jeb rode out with 2 men, returning at dusk with a face like a thundercloud. Axles snapped clean," he announced to Gideon in the yard. "Wagons stuck fast. It'll be a week before the smith in town can forge a new one and get it out there. We'll have to ration the grain." Gideon's expression was grim. "A week without full rations will put the horses in poor shape for the roundup." Mercy, on her way back to her cabin, paused in the shadows of the barn, listening. She had seen the map of the territory tacked to the wall in the main house office when she was delivering Gideon's clean laundry. She had studied it, memorizing the creeks and trails, a habit born of a life where knowing the lay of the land could mean survival. She stepped out of the shadows. "Mr. Gideon." Both men turned, surprised. Jeb's face soured. "This ain't your concern, woman." Mercy kept her eyes on Gideon. "There's an old logging trace that cuts across the ridge. It's not on most maps. It passes within a quarter-mile of where the wagon is. You could bring the supplies back with pack mules. It would take 2 trips, maybe 3. You could have everything back here by tomorrow night." Silence. Jeb stared at her, his mouth agape. Gideon's gaze was sharp, probing. "How would you know about a logging trace?" "My husband and I? We used it last year, trying to find a pass through the mountains," she said, the lie coming easily. The truth, that she had spent hours studying the map because it was the only piece of paper in this place that promised a world beyond the ranch, was too complicated. "It's overgrown, but it's solid ground." Gideon considered her for a long moment. He looked at Jeb, whose face was a mask of resentment, then back to her. "Show me on the map," he said. It was not a request. She followed him into the house, into the office that smelled of leather and tobacco, and his cold, solitary presence. It was the first time she had been in a room with him since her arrival. He lit a kerosene lamp, the warm glow pushing back the shadows. He was close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the silver threads at his temples. He was a man worn down by responsibility. She moved to the map on the wall, her finger tracing the faint, forgotten line. "Here. It branches off the main trail just past Miller's Creek and rejoins here, south of the pass." His eyes followed her finger. He was silent for a long time, studying the map, then studying her. She could feel his mind at work, weighing her words, judging her. He was not a man who trusted easily. "Jeb," he called out the door, "take 4 men and the pack mules. You'll leave at first light. This woman will show you the turnoff." He looked back at Mercy. "You'll ride with them." It was a test, and a promotion, from the laundry to the trail. Jeb's glare could have curdled milk, but he only nodded curtly at Gideon. "Yes, sir." The next morning, Mercy found a steady-looking mare saddled and waiting for her. She had not been on a horse in months, and her body protested, but the feel of the leather reins in her hands was a familiar comfort. She led Jeb and his men to the overgrown trace, a path almost invisible to the untrained eye. Jeb was sullen and refused to speak to her, but the other men watched her with a new, grudging respect. They had the supplies back to the ranch by nightfall the following day. The horses had their grain, the cook had his salt, and a crisis had been averted. Gideon was waiting in the yard when they rode in. He watched the men unload the heavy sacks, his face unreadable. His eyes met Mercy's for a moment across the busy yard. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was more praise than she had received in her entire life. It was a beginning. After that, things began to shift. It was not a sudden change, but a slow, quiet turning of a great wheel. 2 days after the supply run, Gideon found her not in the wash house, but at the small rickety desk in her cabin, a piece of charcoal in her hand, scrawling figures on the back of a discarded provision list. Leo was asleep on the cot, which now had a mattress of straw she'd stuffed into a mended grain sack. "What is this?" he asked, his large frame filling the doorway. She did not startle. She had heard his heavy footfalls approaching. "I was just trying to make sense of the grain usage," she said, her voice even. "If you were to build a secondary feed trough at the north pasture, you could cut the daily waste by 10%. The horses drop almost that much on the long walk back to the main barn." He stepped inside, taking the paper from her. He studied her neat columns of figures, his brow furrowed in concentration. She had calculated the number of horses, the daily ration, the spillage, the cost. It was all there, a simple, logical argument for a change he had never considered. "The foreman is meant to handle this," he said, but there was no heat in his words. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. "The foreman is busy with the men," she replied softly. "Sometimes it's hard to see the small leaks when you're trying to keep the whole ship afloat." He looked from the paper to her, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her. Not as a stray, not as a laundress, but as a mind. He handed the paper back to her. "Build the trough," he said, and walked away. The next week, he moved her out of the wash house. Her new job had no title. She was simply told to work from the main house office. The desk was large and cluttered with years of disorganized receipts, branding tallies, and supply orders. Jeb's handwriting was a barely legible scrawl. Mercy spent the first few days simply putting things in order, creating a system of files, a ledger for expenses, a chart for the breeding schedule of the cattle. The chaos slowly yielded to her quiet, relentless logic. Gideon would often stand in the doorway and watch her work, a cup of coffee in his hand. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant, steadying thing. Sometimes he would ask her a question. "How much barbed wire do we have in storage?" Or, "When is the farrier due next?" She always knew the answer. She had made his sprawling, chaotic operation her own. She had learned its rhythms, its needs, its weaknesses. One evening, she was working late, trying to reconcile the tally from the spring branding with the number of cattle being driven to the summer pasture. The numbers were wrong. 20 head were missing. She was hunched over the ledger, the flickering candlelight making the figures dance, when Gideon entered the office. He didn't light another lamp, just stood in the warm shadows. "You should be sleeping," he said. His voice was softer than usual. "The numbers don't match," she said, rubbing her tired eyes. 20 head are unaccounted for." He came to stand behind her, leaning over her shoulder to look at the ledger. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint scent of leather and clean sweat. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the closest they had ever been, a proximity that felt both dangerous and deeply comforting. "Jeb's count," he murmured, his finger tracing the messy column of numbers. "He's gotten careless." He was silent for a moment. Or something else. He straightened up, and the small, intimate space between them vanished. "We'll ride out to the north pasture at dawn. You'll come with me. You know the numbers better than anyone." That night, Mercy lay on her cot, listening to the sound of Leo's steady breathing. She replayed the moment in the office, the feeling of Gideon's presence behind her. It was a moment of quiet partnership, a recognition of a shared purpose. She was no longer just a worker on his ranch. She was becoming something more, something essential. And that terrified her as much as it thrilled her. She was a woman with a past she never spoke of, building a life in the shadow of a man who never spoke of his. It was a fragile foundation, one she feared could crumble at any moment. The fall came on slowly, painting the cottonwoods along the creek in strokes of brilliant gold. With it came a new urgency: harvest. It was the single most important time of year for the ranch, the culmination of a year's labor. This year, the responsibility for organizing it fell not to Jeb, but to Mercy. Gideon had made the declaration quietly one morning, not in front of the men, but to her alone in the office. "You'll run the harvest," he'd said. "You'll make the schedules, organize the wagons, handle the payroll. Jeb will manage the men in the field. But the operation is yours." It was an incredible trust, a validation that stole her breath. But it also placed a target squarely on her back. Jeb's resentment, which had been simmering for months, now boiled over into open hostility. He contradicted her orders, sowed dissent among the men, and took every opportunity to imply that her position had been earned in a manner unbefitting a lady. The whispers followed her everywhere, slithering through the bunkhouse and the barn. Mercy ignored them. She focused on the work, her mind a whirlwind of logistics. She created a master schedule, coordinating the teams of reapers, the wagons hauling the grain, and the hands working the threshing machine. She found a way to stagger the work to give the horses more rest, a small change that would increase their endurance over the long weeks. She organized the cookhouse to provide hot meals in the fields, boosting the men's morale. The operation began to run with a smooth, efficient rhythm it had never known before. Gideon watched it all, a silent observer. He rode the fields, his presence a quiet endorsement of her authority. When one of the hands questioned her decision to rotate the cutting fields, Gideon's voice cut through the man's complaint like a whip. "You'll do as she says. Her word on this is mine." The grumbling ceased. One evening, a chill wind promised the first frost. Leo came down with a cough, his small body hot with fever. All of Mercy's carefully constructed composure crumbled. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She sat by his cot all night, bathing his forehead with cool water, whispering prayers into the darkness. Just before dawn, the cabin door creaked open. It was Gideon. He carried a small wooden box. He didn't say a word, just knelt by the cot, his large, calloused hand gently touching Leo's cheek. The gesture was so tender, so unexpected, it brought tears to Mercy's eyes. "My wife," he began, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. "She was skilled with herbs. This was her remedy for fever." He opened the box. Inside were dried leaves and roots. He showed Mercy how to steep them into a tea, his movements precise and practiced. They sat in silence as the sky lightened, two people bound by a shared, unspoken fear for a child. He spoke of his wife for the first time, not of how she died, but of how she had lived, of her kindness, her laughter. And Mercy, in turn, found herself speaking of her husband, of his quiet strength, of the dreams they had shared. In the fragile light of dawn, surrounded by the scent of herbs and the sound of a child's fevered breathing, the walls between them began to dissolve. He reached across the small space and took her hand. His thumb stroked the back of it, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated comfort. "He will be well," Gideon said, his eyes meeting hers. "You are a good mother, Mercy." The fever broke the next day. As Leo's strength returned, something new and delicate began to grow between Mercy and Gideon. They would speak in the evenings on the porch of the main house, watching the stars appear. He would tell her about his plans for the ranch, and she would listen, offering her own quiet insights. He taught her how to read the clouds, how to predict the weather by the behavior of the birds. She, in turn, taught him how to see the small details he had always overlooked. The way the light hit the hills at dusk, the intricate patterns of a spider's web. She was showing him the world he owned, but had never truly seen. Jeb watched this growing closeness with venomous eyes. He saw his own position, his own history with Gideon, being erased. He saw a future where he was obsolete, and so he decided to burn it all down. He rode into the nearby town of Redemption, a place Mercy had never been, and he began to talk. He went to the saloon, the general store, the church social. He planted seeds of poison, whispering about the mysterious widow at the Cross G Ranch, the woman who had appeared from nowhere with a child and bewitched the grieving rancher. He hinted at a dark past, at a woman who knew how to use her wiles to get what she wanted. The rumors spread like wildfire in the dry season. The town, which had barely known of Mercy's existence, now buzzed with her name. She was a saloon girl from up north, run out of the last town for theft. She was a grifter, the child a prop in her scheme. The stories grew more lurid with each telling. Mercy knew nothing of this until the day the preacher came to call. He was a stern, self-righteous man named Reverend Miller, and he arrived with two of the town's most prominent matriarchs, their faces pinched with disapproval. They found Mercy outside the main house, going over a wagon manifest with one of the hands. Mrs. the preacher began, pointedly refusing to use her late husband's name. We have come to speak with you about the state of your soul and the scandal you are bringing upon this decent community. Mercy was stunned into silence. The ranch hand faded away, not wanting to be part of the confrontation. The two women stared at her, their eyes raking over her simple work dress as if it were a scarlet gown. There are stories, one of the women, Mrs. Gable, said, her voice dripping with false concern. Stories about your past, about your intentions toward Mr. Gideon, a man in his vulnerable, grieving state. The attack was so sudden, so vicious, she felt the air leave her lungs. She looked from their hard, judgmental faces toward the main house, hoping Gideon would appear. But he was out on the range, miles away. She was alone. My intentions are to do my job, Mercy said, her voice shaking slightly. And to raise my son. Some question whether he is even your son, the preacher said, his voice low and accusatory. Or simply a tool of your deception. That struck her like a physical blow. The insinuation was monstrous. All the strength she had carefully built over the past months seemed to drain away, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She saw then that her competence, her hard work, meant nothing. To them, she would always be an outsider, a woman alone, and therefore, a woman to be suspected. You should leave, the other woman said, her voice cold. For the sake of the child, and for the good of this community, you are not welcome here. They left her standing there, their words hanging in the air like poison. The harvest, the ledgers, the respect she had earned from the hands. It was all an illusion. In the eyes of the world beyond the ranch gates, she was a stain. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was bringing that stain upon Gideon. She had found a sanctuary, and now she was in danger of destroying it. When Gideon returned that evening, he found her in the office, but she wasn't working. She was staring out the window, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. He knew immediately that something was wrong. The air in the room was thick with a new and terrible silence. The preacher was here, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. With Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Hewitt. Gideon's face hardened. He had heard the whispers in town himself a few days prior, had dismissed them as the idle gossip of bitter people. He had not realized the poison had reached his own front door. What did they say? Mercy turned to face him, and he saw the profound weariness in her eyes, the return of the haunted look she'd worn the day she arrived. They said what people are saying, what Jeb has been telling them, about me, about Leo. She couldn't bring herself to repeat the vile accusations. She didn't have to. She saw in his face that he understood. He took a step toward her. Mercy, it's lies. The talk of fools. Is it? She asked, her voice quiet but sharp with pain. You don't know anything about me, Gideon. Not really. I showed up here with nothing but a saddlebag. You took me in, but you don't know who I am. You don't know where I came from. He stopped. She was right. He had never asked. He had respected her privacy, her unspoken desire to leave the past behind. But now, that silence stood between them like a chasm. He looked at her, at this woman who had brought order to his chaotic life, who had made him feel something other than the dull ache of grief for the first time in years. And he hesitated. The fear of being betrayed again, the memory of a past loss, made him cautious. He wanted to trust her completely, but the wound he carried was deep. He didn't accuse her. He didn't doubt her. But he asked the question. Then tell me. The question itself was the crack in the foundation. For her, it meant his faith in her was not absolute. It meant the whispers had found purchase, however small, in his own mind. Her heart broke. She had thought, foolishly, that what they were building was strong enough to withstand any storm. But it was as fragile as a house of cards. There is nothing to tell, she said, her voice hollow. "I am a widow. My husband died of lung fever on the trail. Leo is my son." That is the entire story. If you can't believe that, then there's nothing more to say. She walked past him, out of the office and out of the house. She did not go back to her cabin. Instead, she walked to the creek, to the place where she and Leo had spent their first evenings. The golden leaves of the cottonwoods seemed to mock her, their beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness that had invaded her life. She had brought this shame upon him. The town would turn against him because of her. She could not let that happen. She had run before, and she would run again. It was the only way to protect the people she cared for. That night, she packed. It didn't take long. Everything she owned still fit inside the single saddlebag. She folded her spare dress, her son's shirt. She tucked her husband's Bible inside. She looked at Leo, sleeping peacefully, his face untroubled. She would take him away from the whispers, away from the pointing fingers. They would find somewhere else, somewhere they could be anonymous again. It was a bleak and lonely prospect, but it was better than staying and watching the poison she had brought destroy the first good thing she had found. Before the first hint of dawn, she lifted her sleeping son into her arms, grabbed the saddlebag, and slipped out of the cabin. The ranch was silent, sleeping. A faint light glowed in the main house, Gideon's office. She imagined him in there, wrestling with his doubts. The thought was a fresh stab of pain. She would not say goodbye. A clean break was kinder. She headed for the main gate, a small solitary figure moving through the pre-dawn gloom, leaving behind the only home she had known since her world had fallen apart. She had just reached the massive wooden gate at the edge of the property when a figure emerged from the shadows of the stable. It was Gideon. He wasn't angry. His face, in the pale light, was etched with a deep and profound sorrow. He had known she would leave. "Don't," he said. The single word was not a command, but a plea. "I have to," she whispered, clutching Leo tighter. "I won't bring this trouble on you. I won't have them looking at my son that way." "This isn't your trouble. It's Jeb's malice and the town's foolishness. Running from it gives them the victory." He took a step closer. "I was a fool last night. My own ghosts made me hesitate. My fear of being hurt again made me ask a question I already knew the answer to. I know who you are, Mercy. I've seen it every day for months. I see it in the way you work, the way you care for your son, the way you look at the sunset. That is the truth. The rest is just noise." Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. His words were a balm on a raw wound, but the practical problem remained. "The noise is loud, Gideon. It will hurt you. It will hurt your standing in this territory." He shook his head, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "My standing." He looked back toward the house, then at her. "For 3 years I've had my standing. I've had this land, and I've been the loneliest man in God's creation. It meant nothing. Until you came." He closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to gently cup her face. "Stay. Let me fight this. Let me prove them wrong." His thumbs wiped away her tears. In his eyes, she saw no doubt, only a fierce, protective certainty. He was choosing her, not in the quiet of his office, but here, at the gate, with the whole world waiting to judge him. It was the bravest thing she had ever seen. She nodded, unable to speak. He took Leo from her arms, his hold on the boy as natural and sure as if he'd done it 1,000 times. He slung her saddlebag over his other shoulder. "Let's go back to the house," he said softly. "Then we're going to town." Later that morning, Gideon's wagon rolled down the main street of Redemption. He sat tall on the driver's bench, with Mercy beside him, holding Leo on her lap. He didn't stop at the livery or the smithy. He pulled the wagon to a halt directly in front of the general store, the social heart of the town. It was Saturday morning, and the store was crowded. He helped Mercy down from the wagon as if she were a queen, then took Leo's hand. Together, the three of them walked up the steps and into the store. A hush fell over the room. Conversations died. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, and a half-dozen other townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of shock and disapproval. Jeb was there, standing near the back, a smirk on his face that faltered when he saw the look in Gideon's eyes. Gideon did not raise his voice. He let the silence stretch, forcing every person in the room to look at him, at Mercy, at the child holding his hand. "I'm sure you've all heard stories lately," he said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "Stories started by a man who values his pride more than the truth." He glanced at Jeb, who shrank back. "This is Mercy, and this is her son Leo. Starting today, she is not just running my harvest. She is my partner in running the entire ranch. Her word is my word. Her authority is my authority. Anyone who has a problem with that, anyone who chooses to spread lies or treat her with disrespect, will find they are no longer welcome on my land or in my business." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent crowd. "We are a community. We are supposed to help our neighbors, not tear them down with whispers. I expect better from all of you." He then turned to the storekeeper. "I need a barrel of flour, 10 pounds of sugar, and a bag of lemon drops for the boy." He conducted his business as if he had not just turned their entire social order on its head. He was choosing her, publicly, irreversibly, and damning the consequences. He was shielding her with his name, his power, his reputation. He was saving her. But her own part in their mutual salvation was yet to come. They returned to a ranch in chaos. In their absence, Jeb, in a final act of spiteful sabotage, had jammed the gears of the threshing machine with a length of iron chain. The machine, the single most vital piece of equipment for the harvest, was broken. A full day's cutting lay in heaps, waiting to be processed. If it wasn't threshed soon, it would rot. The harvest, and a significant portion of Gideon's fortune, would be lost. The men stood around the silent machine, helpless. Jeb was gone, having ridden off as soon as his dirty work was done. The mood was grim. "It'll take a week to get the smith out here," one of the hands said. "The grain will be ruined by then." Gideon's face was a mask of cold fury. He stared at the broken machine, the symbol of his entire livelihood, crippled by one man's hatred. It was Mercy who stepped forward. In the long nights in the office, she hadn't just studied the ledgers. She had studied everything, including the worn, oil-stained manufacturer's schematics for the thresher that Gideon kept in a dusty drawer. She had traced its gears and belts with her finger, fascinated by the mechanical logic of it. "Get me a pry bar and the large wrench," she said, her voice cutting through the men's despair. They stared at her. "Now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She climbed onto the machine, her dress catching on the gears. She peered into the works, her mind seeing not a mess of broken metal, but the diagram from the schematics. "The main drive gear is jammed," she announced, "but I don't think the teeth are stripped." She directed two of the strongest men, showing them exactly where to apply the pry bar for leverage. She instructed another on how to ease the tension on the main belt. She spoke with a calm, quiet authority that silenced all doubt. The men, who had resented the idea of taking orders from a woman, now followed her instructions without question. They saw a competence that transcended gender, a mind at work that could save them all. It took 2 hours of grueling work. Mercy's hands were scraped and black with grease. But at last, with a great groaning sound, the chain came free. She inspected the gears, her touch surprisingly gentle. "They're intact," she said, a smudge of grease on her cheek. "We can work." She looked up and saw Gideon watching her. He hadn't interfered, hadn't offered a single suggestion. He had simply stood back and trusted her. The look in his eyes was one of awe and a love so profound it made her heart ache. She had not only saved the harvest, she had saved his ranch. She had rescued him just as surely as he had rescued her that morning at the gate. The last of the grain was in the silo. The fields were bare under a crisp autumn sky, and the ledgers showed the most profitable harvest the Cross G Ranch had ever seen. The whispers in town had died, replaced by a grudging respect and a fair bit of awe for the quiet woman who had faced down gossip and broken machinery with the same unshakable calm. Jeb was a bitter memory. The ranch hands now came to Mercy with their questions first, accepting her authority as a natural fact. The world had shifted, settling into a new and better shape. Mercy stood on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. Leo was inside, asleep in a real bed in a real room. She was no longer living in the line cabin. She had a room in the house, a space that was hers, but it still felt temporary, a state of grace that might end. Gideon came to stand beside her, so close their shoulders brushed. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, a habit that had become the bedrock of their relationship. Words were often unnecessary between them. "The line cabin is too small," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. Mercy's heart gave a lurch. She thought he was about to tell her it was time to move on, that with the harvest done, her purpose here was finished. She steeled herself for the blow. He turned to her, his expression serious. "It's too small for the three of us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring, but a single, heavy, iron key. It was the key to the front door of the house. He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "This house hasn't been a home in a very long time," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's just been a place I lived. I think you and Leo could change that, if you'd be willing to." It was not a flowery proposal. It was something better. It was a statement of need, a quiet, irreversible choice. He was offering her not just his name but his life, his future, his home. He was offering her belonging. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. She looked from the key in her hand to his face, his strong, kind, broken face that she had somehow helped to mend. She had arrived with nothing but a child and a saddlebag, a woman erased by hardship. Now, she was the heart of this entire operation, the center of this man's world. "Yes," she whispered, "we would be willing." He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, holding the key between their clasped palms. They stood together on the porch, watching the last light fade, no longer two lonely souls against the vastness of the frontier, but a family, finally, truly home.